I should have probably done this video much earlier to save my fellow dungeon masters from countless insipid questions about people wanting to play Driz T in the known world, but discovering Mystara refreshingly Drow-free. The differences between Drow and Shadow Elves. Both are religious, both are subterranean, and the comparison stops there. If you're running a Mystara campaign in 5th edition and you've got players that say if it's in the book, it's in the setting, sit them down and show them this video. Straitjacket and eye clamps are optional. I'm Mr. Welch, and it's time to compare Drow and Shadow Elves. Drow are possibly the biggest victims in the Forgotten Realms' kitchen sink approach to setting design. Originally they were this mysterious and alien creature that you didn't even know existed. They were a surprise reveal at the end of Against the Giants, and the actual bad guys behind the scenes. You couldn't play them, they were pure evil, sporting hand crossbows, whips, and some really cool mustaches. There was only one of them found on the surface, Tislan San over in the Valley of the Mage. They were a bad guy race, left undefined as murderous elves waiting beneath the surface to hack up adventurers who delve too deep. They had unique abilities, a distinct appearance, and Lolth wasn't a household name then. Strangely enough, their first appearance they had pale skin and curly hair, which was changed to the coal-black skin and straight white hair in reprints. From what I could find out from official sources, it was because the original pale-skinned elves didn't look good in the black and white design of the early books. Then the Forgotten Realms came, and Drow were one of the first races borged into Faerun. The awesome stashes were sadly gone, and suddenly everything remained the same as their lore was expanded upon and turned into the spider-obsessed lingerie-wearing arachnophiles they're known for. Lolth was already a spider-shaped demon back in Greyhawk, but the realms cranked up the spider fetish to 11 when they borged to the Drow. Okay, they ramped up a lot of the fetishes when they added the Drow. Let's just say you ain't going broke selling leather or lace in Menzoberranzan. To make a very long story short, Drow were a race of surface elves who followed the elfin god Arushni, who was a very naughty girl and decided she needed to overthrow the corrupt and vain Corellian Lorathian, the same one that had been kidnapping fairies to serve as cannon fodder in his eternal war with the Primordials. Arushni plotted with her son to overthrow Cori and blame everything on her daughter Elistrae. So war breaks out, she loses, and all the rebellious elves gets cursed, and she gets tossed into the abyss, where she becomes Lolth the Spider Queen. Her son Varun also gets tossed into the abyss, as does her daughter, who actually did nothing wrong, but felt since she was a Drow, she deserved to be punished as well. That naughty girl. The Drow were then cursed with dark skin and sunlight sensitivity, but elves being elves, they got all these cool extra abilities to make up for all the bad stuff in the form of magic resistance and free spells. Because elves. A few points before I continue. By dark skin, I mean coal black or dark gray. They aren't an allegory for anything, except for some writer's kinks with all the S&M gear that seems to be in a lot of the art. There's people that keep trying to read too much into the works of fantasy, which can get annoying. Drow don't represent minorities. Orcs don't represent minorities. I've even read of one guy claiming the bad guy from Predator represented oppressed minorities. Any guy that can toss around Carl Weathers, Sonny Landham, Jesse Ventura, Shane Black, Richard Chavez, and Bill Duke like ragdolls aren't oppressed. Well, maybe Shane Black gets a pass. People really need to stop reading too much into fiction. I have many friends that are black, and only one of them is 7 foot tall with glow-in-the-dark blood, mandibles, and hunts humans for sport. And that still isn't cool, Kevin. I've been needing to get that off my chest for a while. Curtains, blue, and all that. Actually, I think that's the problem. Drow were turned into pure fetish bait. Having read through enough submitted works at my magazine, I can recognize an author trying to sneak in a kink. And that would explain so much. Why they went from nightmare creatures of darkness to wearers of impractical and barely there black leather and lace when it flipped settings. The change of appearance was high-octane fetish fuel. Drow were just another bad guy race until R.A. Salvatore came along with the Crystal Shard and gave us Driz T Doe-Urden, the good guy Drow who would later become the bane of many a campaign. Driz T gets a lot of derision for suddenly everybody becoming emotionally torn lone wolf Drow rangers who were secretly good guys rebelling against their evil family and culture. But back in the day, he was incredibly original. He was a prime example of the trailblazer being dragged down by all the subpar copycats to follow him. And that is a problem with a lot of works of art. The original is great, but there's so many duplicates that the quality of the first gets forgotten in the sea of cheap knockoffs. It's sad, but it's also unavoidable. It's like a movie series that's up to part 9 and all the original actors have left and it's just straight-to-video hell now. But years later, when you rewatch the first movie that started it all, you realize you've forgotten how funny it was back in the day. Most people know Drow from 2nd edition, with the underground cities, the constant warring, and the feuding, and the matriarchal society with men being reduced to slaves or cannon fodder. Since Forgotten Realms has been the default setting for D&D for several editions now, this is what all the new players just tend to read. They know about spiders everywhere, whips, hand crossbow, and Drow being evil for evil's sake. Because of the popularity of the Driz novels, they went from a spooky mystery bad guy to apparently on the surface constantly. They were the original rare race that suddenly appeared everywhere, and you can place the blame firmly on the Forgotten Realms for being a fantasy Mos Eisley cantina, for giving Drow-fueled headaches for DMs running campaigns in Mystara, Krynn, Athas, or Abrinus, which represent more than half of the older settings, and all of them are Drow-free. Drow have had a lot of changes from edition to edition. They appeared as playable characters first in Unearthed Arcana, where they got dual weapon fighting with no penalties at all, a host of free spells to cast, but had a -2 to hit and dexterity and bright lights. Oddly enough, first edition stripped them of their famous magic resistance, because Drow PCs had left their Underdark layers to go adventuring. Also remember that first edition Drow were still Greyhawk elves. Drow in second edition were featured in the Complete Book of Elves, the same book that TSR later apologized for. The book that says elves are known for their frail constitution, but they get high resistance to disease and heal quickly without scarring, because elves. And let's not mention the Bladesinger. Drow have a bit of conflict in the book, as it can't decide how infravision works, but says their eyes generate heat, so they look like two flaming eyes when viewed from the dark. They also take a serious hit to charisma, but get extra points to intelligence and even more dexterity. They, of course, get lots of free spells per day, with 6 for regular Drow, and the priestesses adding another 4 free spells on top of that, for 10 free spells at level 4 for the priestesses. They get 50% magic resistance, plus another 2% per level to a maximum of 80%. They get a +2 to saving throws against magic, because reasons. They still have the sunlight penalty, and have to return to the Underdark every 2 weeks or lose the free spells. The Drow do have a 20% penalty on all XP, so that kind of balances it. Unless you're playing a cleric or a thief with their rapid advancement charts, in which case it's a minor annoyance. Thinking back, I'm pretty sure 2nd edition was when players started souring on Drow. That's a lot of rules for the bad boys of the Forgotten Realms. 3rd edition kept the XP penalty with a whopping +2 ECL, which means you have to get to level 4 for everybody else before you actually reach level 2. You keep the magic resistance, and of course the free spells, plus a few other abilities. 4th edition waters them down, so they're just like everybody else, which was a complaint of 4th edition. And 5th edition keeps the elves with Fey ancestry and free spells and, of course, light sensitivity that a huge chunk of players will immediately say doesn't apply to them because they have sunglasses. Note that all the fluff I just mentioned doesn't apply to Eberron Drow, as they have a unique background involving living in a jungle above ground and worshipping scorpions or fire and just running around doing their own thing. They still keep the same rules, though the setting obviously didn't exist until 3rd edition. So if you want to play Eberron in 1st and 2nd edition, you're going to have to homebrew. Then we head over to look at the Shadow Elves, who have much less written material, but also a far more diverse wardrobe. Instead of being cursed by the gods and turned into dominatrixes and gimps, instead they are refugees from a pair of holocausts of Blackmoor origin. They do live underground, but the world below is much more dangerous than the Underdark with its environmental challenges. They're a theocracy like the Drow, but where Lolth is sadistic and vengeful, Raphael is protective and forward-thinking. To drive the differences between the two even further home, Raphael wasn't even an elf before he ascended. He was a Blackmoorian technician who somehow ascended when Blackmoor exploded. He discovered the elves while trying to figure out how he became immortal and tasked himself with their survival. What a nice guy. The elves that would become the Shadow Elves lived in what would be Glantry right when Blackmoor blew itself up. They had to flee underground, and the surface was not a healthy place to be right after the Great Rain of Fire. Glantry was covered in ice in the time after the explosion, which would have corresponded with the elemental chaos mentioned in the Sea People's Crucible. The Shadow Elves returned to the surface centuries later, but another group of elves set off another Blackmoor device nearby and drove them back underground. There they settled permanently, always wanting to return to the surface but not having a place to return to. Then the always hard to spell immortal Azantiodal tried to corrupt them. Another group of elves called the Shotten Elves joined them and then tried to betray them. And then they found out about Alfheim and were rebuffed trying to resettle there because there's not enough space. Not going to cover the full history. That'll be in the Shadow Elf remaster video when I can get to it. This is more of a breakdown of the Shadow Elves mentally and physically. Shadow Elves physically have pale skin and light hair, typically blonde rather than pure white, though that is possible. They're shorter than other elves, like the Drow, but not instantly to a noticeable degree. They have larger ears than the surface elves, but then again, this isn't enough to make them stand out. They have their own version of Elven, which can be understood by anyone who speaks Elven, though it is spoken rather quickly and their accents tend to be high-pitched. They can learn to impersonate surface elves, and they can learn to change their dialect to blend in with the other elves if need be. They do have a strong resemblance to the water elves of Minrathad, which is purely coincidental, but it still gives them a convenient cover story if they have to go to the surface. Shadow Elves tend to be naive because of their isolation. Their king knows what's going on above ground, and why the Sylvan Elves have refused to open up their nation to the Shadow Elves. The reason is pragmatic. There's just too many Shadow Elves to settle in Alfheim. It wouldn't be able to support them all. The king, however, took this as a slight and tells his people the surface elves are selfish and won't give them their due. There are Shadow Elves that know the truth, but they either keep the secret to themselves or they are exiled to keep the lie going. What would happen to the king if the secret was made public is unknown, but it probably would not be pleasant. Shadow Elves have adopted their culture because of the hostility of their surroundings. Ground travel is often impossible because of the unstable terrain or the environmental hazards like poison gas. Most travel outside their cities is done by skinwings, flying lizards of varying sizes. There are no Shadow Elf armies massing against the surfaced elves. They have several traditions that outsiders would find cruel. They cast out their elders, lest they become a draw on the race's limited resources. And for the same reason, they abandon deformed children. They view it as a necessary evil. Though the immortal Raphael does what he can to make sure the exiled and the abandoned find homes and don't perish. What a nice guy. The stereotypical personality of a Shadow Elf is about as far from a Drow as possible. Shadow Elves keep to themselves. They don't show strong emotions publicly, and even open displays of affection are frowned upon. They do have drinking houses where they can go meet members of the opposite sex, and can even hold hands if they're brazen enough. They lead austere lives, since basic items like glass or dyes are rare in their region. Most of their clothing is loose-fitting, and bright colors are almost unheard of in Shadow Elf society because of the difficulties acquiring cloth dye in their society. Anyone wearing brightly colored clothing is generally considered very wealthy, and is also considered very garish. Many Shadow Elves who make it to the surface find it mind-blowing the variety of simple products that are available and in great quantities. Surface Shadow Elves that are not spies for the king are enraged upon discovering his lies, especially when they discover that the majority of the races have no idea who they even are, and worse, treat them no differently than anybody else up on the surface. Mechanically, the Shadow Elves have no different stat-wise from the Surface Elves. They have a unique class devoted to them in the Shadow Elf Shaman, which is restricted to Shadow Elves that are born with symmetrical purple birthmarks on their face, but the birthmarks have no mechanical benefit at all. More women than men qualify to be shaman, but not so much that male shaman are rare. The sexual makeup between the shamans is about 2-to-1 favoring women. Otherwise, according to Beckme rules, Shadow Elves have the same fighter mage abilities as every other elf. 5th edition does give them a free skill in religion and a minor tweak to dark vision and a different set of racial weapon proficiencies, but certainly not 8 paragraphs of rules like the Drow got in 2nd edition. That is a basic rundown on the differences between Shadow Elves and Drow. One looks like somebody's fetish, the other one looks like a cavefish in a toga. Where Drow are all over the place in the realms, Shadow Elves have few cities below ground and little presence on the surface. Mechanically, Drow Elves haven't met a special rule they didn't like, especially in 2nd edition. Shadow Elves don't even suffer daylight penalties as their eyes adjust. The worst thing they get with the optional rules that were given to them was their dark vision loses 30 feet above ground. Comparing Shadow Elves and Drow is like comparing a Pentecostal Sunday service with the German fetish fair. Next week I'm going to take an in-depth look at the city of Specularum, later named Miros, the capital of Karamikos, and possibly the only city to ever have its name changed because the DM couldn't hear himself talking over all the snickering. But until next week, fetish. Fetish.